All right, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I want to plunge right in at the outset this evening, applying the topics that we discussed last time theoretically, but this time applying them concretely to a real piece of writing. So you'll have a clear example at the outset of the points that we discussed last time. And of course, I've asked you to read part one of Philosophy, Who Needs It?, to use as our example. The 4 points that we're looking for, if we follow the numbering of last time, are motivation, concretization, structure, and delimitation. How does the author motivate the audience, convince them that they should be interested in, should care about the subject? That's motivation. The balance of abstractions and concretes. Does the author go back and forth between giving examples of an abstract point and then tying them up abstractly? Structure. Is there a logical sequence, an order of presentation, and what's the reasons behind it? And finally, delimitation. In what way does the author recognize that A is A, that the Crow epistemology is true, that the audience can only retain so much, and therefore delimit the subject? And I want to take them in the order I just mentioned because it's easier to see. Well, let's start off with motivation. In what way does the author, Miss Rand, motivate the audience? Now you have to here project the problem from the beginning. This is a speech for undergraduates at West Point. Their attitude toward philosophy is the standard attitude of people who know nothing about philosophy except what they hear, and what they hear mostly gives them the impression that this is a series of floating abstractions that has nothing to do with them, with mankind, with life, with anything. Therefore, you have a certain wall of skepticism or disinterest built up in advance. Of course, if you're a famous author like Miss Rand, that helps to break the ice, but leaving aside extracurricular considerations of that kind, you have to address yourself to an audience that has this preliminary skepticism. You have to do something to motivate them, to give them the conviction this has something to do with them, with their values, with their interests. Now I ask you directly, what is the very first thing about this talk which works toward motivating the audience? The title, correct, is the very first thing. Because the title states very economically exactly the motivational problem. That's just a question on the audience's mind, although they would be asking it in a kind of cynical way. Who needs it, but they have to come and hear a talk on it? Well, if the author, right at the beginning, takes cognizance of the fact that that type of question is on the audience's mind and flaunts it, says, fine, you think nobody needs it, I'm prepared to meet that challenge head on, that is already intriguing and makes them think, of course, no 4 words is going to establish motivation, but it makes them think, well, maybe there is some reason to listen. At least the author knows what's on my mind. Now, of course, on motivation, the whole article is motivating because the theme of the whole article is who needs it? Why should you care about this subject? So in a certain sense, you can't escape motivation in this article, but I'm considering more specific things than simply the nature of the theme in this case. What is the next item of motivation right after the title? An element in the paper that is, or in the talk, that is specifically designed to motivate, to enlist the interest of the audience. Starting with the short story. Correct. I will repeat your comments, so please keep them reasonably brief. I'll repeat them so people can hear. It's wonderful to start with a short story because everybody likes one. Now, of course, you can't make an absolute out of this, and please don't think I'm saying every time you write a paper short. Start with a title addressed to your audience of skepticism and then go into a short story. I don't mean anything like that, but just as an example here, it's a certain mystery. Something is happening. There's a certain intrigue. Right off the bat, it helps to break down the cynicism or skepticism of the audience because something interesting is being said which no one would expect in a discussion of philosophy. So it's what you can call a grabber. something to get the audience in right off the bat, break the ice and hold them. And it has been said that the beginning is one of the most crucial elements of a piece, because it's going to be determined very close to the beginning whether you have an audience or not. If you start off poorly, boringly, or too abstractly, your audience will simply tune out, or if it's writing, they won't read it. But if you can do something to grab their attention, to rivet them, then you have a little breathing space, and you don't have to be quite so exciting while you lay your basic context, but you have to get them right off the bat in some way. Now you notice that Miss Rand not only uses the element of a little short story or intriguing mystery, but it's of a specific kind. She uses an astronaut as her example. Now theoretically she could have used any profession, a fiction writer, a professor, whichever, but why was it of help for her in this context to use an astronaut as an example? Yes?
West Point.
Because it's addressed to West Point cadets. And therefore she wants right away to suggest to them, this has something to do with your concerns, with actual practical endeavors, with real life, with the kind of real life that you deal with. This is military hardware, space exploration, the so-called hard-headed, tough subjects that the average student would think, well, philosophy is the farthest possible remove from that. Maybe they might think a theoretical professor needs some kind of philosophy, but an astronaut, that's, so to speak, is their league. And therefore, to begin right off the bat is to start the implication, this has something to do with you, this applies to you, this is relevant to your concerns. Now, if I was actually there while this talk was delivered, and it certainly worked that way. The audience settled down right away, and they were intrigued. What could an astronaut and real-life subjects have to do with philosophy? Was obviously the question on their mind. So there was a good motivating element right at the beginning. Notice, by the way, also another motivating element. Ms. Rand uses you throughout this piece. Now, that is by no means mandatory. That's optional. But in a speech of this kind, where her particular stress is, this applies to you, it is more effective, more motivating to say it applies to you than it applies to man, or it applies to all rational beings. Because then they have to go one step further, and I'm a rational being, therefore it applies to me. But she wants to hammer home the idea, philosophy, who needs it? You do. And therefore, even in the wording, she uses the second person very frequently. That also is a motivating element. Now, there are many other motivating elements in this beyond the opening. Notice, for instance, that throughout the talk, this is still within the framework of motivation, the author is keeping in mind what possible skeptical question might occur to a rational audience at this point. And very frequently she puts that question explicitly into words. She says, in effect, at those points where she thinks, well, this audience might legitimately think, what's this got to do with me? She puts right into words at that point, now you may think, what's this got to do with you? The answer is. Let me give you some examples. For instance, after the talk on page 1, after the introductory example on page 1, the third paragraph from the bottom, she says, this is fantasy, you say. You wouldn't act like that, and no astronaut ever would. Well, that's just the point at which an audience would think, well, yes, that's very interesting, but what has it got to do with me? So right away, she states the thought in their mind, which then opens the line of communication for her to go on and elaborate what it has to do with them. Or again, on the very bottom of that page, right after she stated the three questions, the audience will think, oh, well, I know the answers to those questions. There's a certain skeptical element in their mind that's stopping them then from being motivated. So she immediately says, the last paragraph of page 1, by the time they're old enough to understand, men believe that they know the answers. And the audience listening will think, yeah, I do think I know the answers, but she obviously thinks I don't because she's taking cognizance of that fact. So again, they're still with her. They are being carried along because she is anticipating the type of question that would undercut their motivation. Or if you want one more example of that type of thing, on page 3, the second paragraph from the bottom, which begins, you might claim, as most people do, that you have never been influenced. Well, of course, most of them would probably claim it at that point after they've grasped what it is, So she's right away stating, you think it doesn't apply to you? Fine, I understand that, and now here's the answer. Now, at each point, by anticipating what we could call the audience's skepticism, or at least at the question that would occur to them that might make them tune out, she is stressing, this is relevant, you need it, you specifically. I know the thought on your mind, and here is the answer to it. Now, if you can do this technique, again, it's not mandatory, all of these, there are many, many concretes, many different options you have, but if you can anticipate a legitimate question on an audience's part at the moment when that question occurs to the audience, that is marvelous, and every audience loves it if you can do it. They feel, oh, I'm in sync with the speaker, he knows what's on my mind, he's actually talking to me, he sees what's stopping me and he's telling it to me, and that keeps them interested in what you're saying. Now, remember, of course, there's always rational questions on the part of the audience. If you have an invincibly ignorant audience who simply wouldn't be motivated, even if you told them that their sexual performance would be improved by your talk, you can't do anything, and that comes back to the point you have to assume a rational audience. But within a rational audience, everything you can do to motivate them is crucial, and one thing is to anticipate the points where they're going to have a problem and tell them that. Notice also on motivation that Ms. Rand is not content simply to give them a good, strong motivation at the beginning and then go into the subject and forget about it. Throughout, as a kind of leitmotif, she keeps very briefly reminding them of the practical role of this. Now, for instance, as an example, after each branch of philosophy, if you'll notice on page 2 is the first time, paragraph 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, counting that top one as a full paragraph. After she's stated the questions of metaphysics, she states right away, even before she defines metaphysics, the nature of your actions and of your ambition will be different according to which set of answers you come to accept. Now, she doesn't illustrate it at that point, but she states it, thereby keeping track of the fact that she said philosophy, who needs it? And therefore, she's not going to let that go too long. She's discussing what is metaphysics at this point, therefore she can't go into a detailed discussion of why those questions are crucial, but by the way they're selected, it's enough to keep the issue alive for the audience, and she states it just to remind them. I know what I'm talking about, I'm after the same point, and this is, you see, relevant to your life. And after each branch, you'll see the second paragraph from the bottom on that page, the extent of your self-confidence and of your success will be different according to which answers you accept. And again, page 3, paragraph 2, I don't have to point out the different consequences. You see them everywhere. And then, of course, page 4, the whole page is a summing up of her proof of why you need it. Now, that's an idea of a motivational element running throughout just part 1 of this talk. We could say much more, but it's enough to illustrate some techniques and above all the fact that in some way you have to have a motivating element and it has to run throughout your presentation. All right, now let us look at concretization. Concretization, of course, is the point that when you give an abstraction, you have to give examples. If it's a central abstraction, if it's a crucial, critical one to your purposes. Now, this talk here is particularly excellent at balancing abstractions and concretes. It's a very difficult assignment because it's a very abstract question to take a beginning audience and tell them what is philosophy in all its branches, subdivisions, and interrelations, which is formidable and abstract, and what has it got to do with you? And the only way you can make it clear and interesting is to concretize. But if you concretize too much, then the crow epistemology sets in and they can't hold it. So you have to know. Give certain concretes so they know specifically what you're talking about, then tie it up. And when they get it abstractly, then go back and give some more. Now let us see some examples of this technique. Where is the first example of concretization in this talk? Now, in this case, the talk is what you could call inductive in its approach rather than deductive. And by inductive, I mean in this connection, it starts with the examples and then draws the wider abstraction, rather than starting with the theoretical definitions and then illustrating them, which is what you would call a deductive presentation. Now, who can see where the concretization begins with this paper? The first example. Well, you say it starts from the beginning. In what form does it start? Where is the concretization? Oh, it's a concrete story, but you're slightly switching terms on me. True, it's a concrete story, but when we say concretization, we mean it has to illustrate or exemplify some abstract point which is going to be made. Now, what concretes in that story illustrates something that is later going to be stated abstractly?
First three questions the astronaut asks.
Correct. The first three questions that the astronaut asks are the first concretes relevant to the theme. Where am I? How can I discover it? What should I do? Now, those are simple, concrete questions. They're asked by a specific fictional person. They're clearly understandable, yet those are the very issues of the whole later discussion. The first is obviously where am I, is the example which is later going to be built up into metaphysics. The second, epistemology. The third, ethics. Now, you see that in telling the story, we introduce examples of the three branches in a self-contained, clearly understandable way before she goes near talking about what the abstract branches are. And she does it also in a very intriguing way for purposes of what's coming later. The astronaut does a bad thing in each of these areas. That is, the answer that he gives, he's afraid to look, and he doesn't trust his instruments, and he sits there paralyzed while these creatures are coming, and it's presented in a plausible way. It's not exactly highly likely that an astronaut would do this, but it's not inconceivable. And in concrete form at the outset, therefore, what is suggested? There are certain type of questions that this person had to answer, and if he gave the wrong kind of answers, I could see that that would be very bad. And it's possible. Now, that's all that's communicated at the beginning. No abstractions yet, but some area of territory of questions on a particular case where you could see, yes, that would definitely make a difference. Of course, then it's quickly going to go to, and she herself says so in the second paragraph from the end on page 1, these questions apply to all men. Now, that's another concrete. Where am I? How do I know it? And what should I do? Concrete in the sense of she hasn't yet stated what are the broad issues that those questions involved, but she's simply taking the very questions that the astronaut asked and putting them a little more broadly, and then giving the kind of concrete answers that people would give. Well, I'm in New York City. How do I know it? Well, it's obvious, and so on. So she's repeating once more the first three concretes on a little broader scale. Notice, by the way, one other thing which she has illustrated without yet discussing. What is the order of those questions? What comes first? Well, let's say it simply. She hasn't said metaphysics, but what comes first is, where am I? How do I know? And then what do I do? Now, she hasn't yet said there's a certain structure here, but it's obvious in the framework of that concrete story, well, you don't know what you're going to do till you know where you are. And therefore, a certain question depends on another. So in concrete form, before she comes to abstractions, she has given concrete examples stressing the nature of this subject, or indicating the nature of the subject, its interrelations and its significance, without saying any of it except in the form of a concrete example. So it starts, the whole first page is concrete. Now, we turn over to page 2, and she goes to the abstract. Now, paragraph 3 on page 2 starts an abstract discussion. And observe the first sentence. Philosophy studies the fundamental nature of existence of man and of man's relationship to existence, and then she contrasts it to the special sciences. Now, Try and imagine only the difference. If you came to an audience and you started with, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Our subject is philosophy. Who needs it? Let me give you a definition to begin with. Philosophy studies the fundamental nature of existence of man and of man's relationship to existence." There's immediately two things that take place in the audience's mind. What is he talking about, and who cares? What is he talking about? Because what do you mean by the fundamental nature of existence? That's an enormous abstraction. The fundamental nature of existence could mean, is it made of matter and energy and subatomic particles, or who knows what you're talking about. By itself, it's an extremely broad phrase. And similarly, man's relationship to existence. Well, for most people, the only answer to that question is he's in it. They don't have any further idea. What would you take as his relationship to existence? The whole question just simply does not have any concrete significance in their mind. Therefore, if you started with that, they simply look at you in that kind of glazed way without any idea what does it specifically mean. But if you start with the astronaut, now true, there's still a big jump, and it still needs a lot of elaboration, but you have a concrete to anchor it. Well, yes, I know why the astronaut had to say, "Where am I?" And if that's the stand-in for the nature of existence, I see that there's some type of thing there that you'd have to know, you see. Well, she still has to go on and illustrate it, but you have prepared the ground. And by the same token, you have given them the so what. Because if you simply came in and said the fundamental nature of existence, they'd say, who cares? But after the astronaut, they have enough, a glimmer to know, well, this type of question, I guess, makes a difference. At least they have enough to follow you to that point, you see. So on the base of the first concretes, she can then go on to give the very abstract formulation. Now, notice with regard to each branch of philosophy. Each branch is presented with concrete questions and then an abstract summary. So the whole thing is shuttling back and forth, always because the abstractions are so broad that without examples they convey nothing. But you can't just give a whole bunch of examples because then they don't add up to anything, and you lose it because of the Crow epistemology, so you have to tie it up. And the whole essence of excellent writing in this regard is the shuttling back and forth. And you see on all three branches of philosophy, the first three, how she does it. Now notice, for instance, on metaphysics. There's a paragraph, number 4 on page 2, which gives a whole bunch of specific questions, and then it's added up into the study of existence as such, or being qua being. Now again, if you just said that, no one would know what it meant. Even if they had some idea of the fundamental nature of existence from the astronaut, what is being qua being? What is the study of existence as such? What could it possibly consist of? But if you say, it means, are there laws? Are there miracles? Are things real? Etc. and so on. And you give examples of the type of issue that come under it. You give a content, and then when you say, this is the study of existence as such, you say, oh yes, I get an idea that there is a field there and what it would specifically deal with. The same is true on epistemology, a whole bunch of specific questions of a kind that a beginning audience could understand, and then the definition. Notice, however, that the procedure is changed when she gets to ethics. On the bottom paragraph of page 2, she defines ethics first and then gives examples only later. Why is that? In metaphysics and epistemology, she gives the examples first and then the abstract summary. In ethics, she plunges right in with the definition. You can take for granted that people in a general way know what ethics is. They know that it has to do with good and evil, right and wrong, how you should live, and of course they have some idea that has something to do with life. Therefore, you don't have to, it won't strike people as a horrendous vague abstraction that has nothing to do with anything, and so you can give the definition first and then go into giving a few examples to concretize it. Whereas in metaphysics and epistemology, it is so abstract, you have to first concretize. Notice what the concretization is focused on in the top paragraph of page 3. Ms. Rand is not so much concerned there to illustrate what ethics deals with. That's a side issue, I say, because that's generally known. But what is she more concerned with concretizing in that paragraph on the top of page 3? Well, no, not the results. That's one of the things. You mean whether, you say she's concerned to concretize the results, whether man is happy or miserable. No, but the main focus of the paragraph is on something else. The examples illustrate something else. Notice she gives examples that come from metaphysics and epistemology and then try to show how they lead to different views in ethics on concrete cases. So what is her main focus? No, not just that ethics are a guide to action. She wouldn't have to, why does she have to go into the whole first half of that paragraph on metaphysics and epistemology? Yes, she's dealing with happiness and self-sacrifice, but that isn't the answer to my point. She has a specific thing that she's trying to concretize in this paragraph, that ethical questions have to be based on metaphysics and epistemology. She knows that people know what ethics is. Her focus is always to show philosophy who needs it. That's her theme. Now, people will have an idea that they need ethics. So what they need to be sold on is that they need metaphysics and epistemology. Therefore, her concretization is focused on not what is ethics, but what kind of metaphysical and epistemological questions do you have to answer in order to get to the kind of ethical questions which are important and which you know influence you. Now, let's take one more example of concretization. What would be wrong with the following? Suppose I redid this on page 3, moving ahead to the second last paragraph on page 3. And I were to redo it like this. You might claim, as most people do, you see where I am, second last paragraph of page 3. You might claim, as most people do, that you have never been influenced by philosophy. And then suppose she went on, however, this is false, you must have been influenced because, after all, you live in reality and no one who lives in reality can be indifferent to it. Now, that would be a true, theoretically accurate statement, but it would not have anything like the impact of the way she does it. Why not? What effect would that have? Well, you think it might act as an insult. I didn't have that in mind. How would it act as an insult? Well, I didn't intend it as a put down. I meant it just as you give a purely theoretical answer why you must have been influenced by philosophy. It's so abstract, correct, that a person could follow it. And there has been some preliminary concretization, so they could more or less get it, but we're making a very important different point now. Now we're switching from philosophy, what is it, to philosophy, you need it. And that is so crucial to the theme of the discussion that she's not going to make that point until they have ample evidence on their own case. And therefore, having concretized the branches, the next main thing is to go right to. You don't think you hold this? Well, look, here's an example, here's an example, here's an example. And now the person has, well, I see what all these examples are, and I see that I do hold them. I wonder why. And then they're now set up to say the reason you hold them is because you can't escape it, and then you have the final summary. Now, we could give you more, but you should get from this an idea of what we call shuttling from concretes to abstractions. Different papers, different articles will require different forms of it. If you don't have so abstract a thing, you don't have to concretize so heavily. You may have to go more slowly with a completely raw audience, give more examples, give them metaphysics 1 week and come back the next week and give them the next branch or whichever. But in some form, commensurate with your audience and your subject, you have to go back and forth. And this is an excellent archetype to keep in mind. Now let's look at structure. First, broadly, the structure of this part 1. Now, I would say, and I asked Ms. Rand just to check with her, that there are 4 main divisions to part 1. And this will be perhaps helpful to you in planning out your own pieces. Remember that before you've written a piece, you don't know what's in it. That is, you know your idea, but you haven't yet worded it, organized it, and so on. You have a mass of material in your mind whirling around. And what you want to do is reach an outline, an organization, which will start you somewhere and demarcate. I'm going to start with these points. Then I'm going to go here, and then I'm going to wind up with this. And I'd like to just break this down for you so you can see the structure on a real case. Part 1 of, by part here, I'm counting the whole thing as a self-contained article. I'm not talking about part 2, which we're not discussing. But the first subdivision of this is what you could call the motivation or the orientation. It's in effect the introduction. It's to get them into the subject and establish the bare minimum context necessary. And I would say that is all of page 1 plus the top 2 paragraphs of page 2. Until she gets, there's only one science that can answer them, philosophy. Now, all of that till then is orientation, introduction, the astronaut, the real-life versions of it, what we're dealing with. Then, part 2, what is philosophy, including its branches? And of course, there's an order within it. Metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, politics, aesthetics. That goes until the end of aesthetics in the middle of part 3, page 3, Then the third part, I would call, is the concretization of the fact that philosophy is inescapable. The concretes illustrating that you can't escape it. And that goes from the middle of page 3 till the end of the top paragraph on page 4. And then the last part is the explanation. What it is about the human mind that makes you need philosophy. Why you can't get away from it. The abstract statement of which part 3 was the examples. Now you see there are various forms in which you can do an outline. Some people prefer a much more detailed outline, some people a much briefer, but there is such a phenomenon as an outline on a matchbox. You know, a tiny, tiny outline where you have to condense just the main points in your mind as a guide to yourself. You don't actually have to do it on a matchbox. But I find it helpful, not on a matchbox, but I mean to do it very briefly so you have always in a form that you can easily retain what your main divisions are. And if I were doing this, I would actually write on my outline. Now I might, if I was confused, I might have a much more detailed outline, but the bare minimum that would be my working outline would be 1, intro. That would tell me you have to get the thing started. 2, philo. Philo, P-H-I-L-O. In other words, that would be my shorthand for what is philosophy. And if I wanted to be sure that I remembered, I'd put BR after, which means cover the branches. 3, if you want to write it all out, inescapable parenthesis concretes. In other words, that you can't get away from it, and I'm giving only the examples. And then 4, inescapable parenthesis theory. Now, of course, in each of those, you could have as many subdivisions as you want. You can outline in advance depending upon how much you can hold and how clear it is in your mind. For instance, if I were doing the second branch, what is philosophy, I would not have to outline metaphysics, epistemology, and so on, because I've given that for so many years that if I just would be pressed the right way, it would come out by itself. But intro, I might not be sure what I was going to start with, so I had to decide, well, am I going to start with the astronaut, if I had that example, for instance, or am I going to make some introductory remarks first? Am I going to say, good evening, glad to see you, first keep in mind so-and-so, or am I going to start right in with the story? Those are decisions you'd have to make. And so you might want to indicate the structure of your introduction, and then within your various later parts, what points are you making in what order? You break it down. But of course, if you break it down too much, in too great detail, you'll be writing your article before you've outlined it. And the purpose of the outline is to tell you what you're going to cover in what order. Now, what we're concerned with here, though, is what is the virtue of this particular structure? What is the virtue? Now, remember, I want to stress there is no such thing as one structure which is mandatory for any given topic. There is no perfect article written in Plato's heaven which you are trying to approximate. So there are many different ways that you could do it. But taking this structure as it is, you will see some very obvious virtues in this order, and you will see it if you try a different order. For instance, suppose I started, well, I've in effect told you this under a different point. Suppose I started with point 2. I started with the definition of philosophy. As I've indicated to you, without the initial concretes, without the orienting introductory material, that would be boring. that would be unclear. It would be too abstract. Where it comes after being prepared, even as abstract as it is, people can take it. Or suppose we interchange points 3 and 4. We started with, after we presented up to the end of what is aesthetics, we then went from there right over to, you might not be interested, but why should you be? And then read all of page 4, which would give them a really good reasoning, only without the examples in advance. It would be, I think we even gave that example also, it would be much too abstract, much too unconvincing. Much more effective to say, you don't think that this is relevant to you? Well, you hold this, don't you, and this, and this, and at a certain point, the person begins to wonder, why in the world do I hold all this stuff, since my view is you don't need it, but yet I do have these ideas, isn't that funny? At that point, he's ripe to hear what the reasoning is. Or, let's try a different restructuring, just so you get an idea of a different order. Suppose we started the talk with point 3. Now that is a more plausible organization. In other words, I came in and I said, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. You may say, oh, philosophy has nothing to do with real life, but I want you to check that claim. Have you ever thought or said the following? This is my start. And I said, don't be so sure, nobody can be certain. And I start to give a whole bunch of examples. So that is a fairly common way for good professors to start a course in philosophy, because they know that the class comes in terrifically skeptical, and they want to do whatever they can to enlist the class's interest. But if you started that way, although it's possible, what type of questions? Suppose we started with point 3, and we gave all those examples of the bromides that they hold. What type of questions would be on the reader's, on the listener's mind, which would not be the way they are here, which would throw off the effectiveness of it? So I say, I'm trying to get different people. If you wave your hand back and forth. Yes, I see a dark hand. Well, one thing is, without having delimited the territory and what you're concerned with, the question might be on their minds, are these true or false? And therefore, they would be completely, I hadn't thought of that, but you're right, they would be immediately plunged into the content, whereas your concern in this paper is not, are these true or false, but what are they for? What's the relevance of them? So you wouldn't want, I had in fact a different point that would be on an audience's mind if you give them a whole bunch of examples like this right off the bat. The point I had in mind was very simply the Crow epistemology. They hear 6 or 8 examples, and they would immediately begin to wonder, well, what have these things all got to do with each other? What is the connection? There's only so many you can retain. Now, you see, when you're given it as point 3 of a structure, after you're told what is the subject, what are its divisions, and you have an idea of its relevance, then each one that you hear, each example in point 3 adds more fuel. It's more convincing. It's, oh yeah, there's another example of this subject. But out of the blue, although it might be intriguing, it leaves an audience disoriented. What has it all got to do with each other? Now, of course, there are ways of getting around that, but I say that would be one problem. Also, the question what people's minds, if you started with point 3, would be, well, so what? So I hold these or I don't hold them. What's the difference? What's it got to do with my actual life? Whereas in the context of the astronaut story and the discussion of the branches and the issues, they already have enough to see, well, it has something to do with your life, you see. So it would not be nearly as effective to start with that. Now, this is simply an indication of the virtue of the structure overall. But now within each passage, Ms. Rand has a definite structure of subpoints, and within each paragraph, a definite order. Again, I do not want to inhibit or frighten you into thinking that there is one absolutely right structure. Every paragraph could be written I don't know how many different ways. So don't feel when I point out the virtue of one structure, oh, I could never do that, I never guessed that particular order. You might have another just as good structure. I simply want to give you an example or two so you get the idea that there is a need for a certain progression in all writing, in the overall point structure, and then within each development, even within each paragraph. If you write it a certain way, certain sentences prepare the way for what's to come and make it intelligible. If you don't give the necessary preparation, the same content falls flat. Now, for instance, just to give you an example, take on page 2, paragraph 4, which are the sub-questions that come under metaphysics. Page 2, paragraph 4. Now observe the order of those questions. Now these are simply examples. These are just concretes designed to illustrate what is metaphysics. But notice that they are in a certain order, and that if you change that order within certain limits, the thing would simply fall, even though the same questions were there and the earlier context remained the same. For instance, suppose I kept the paper as it is up to the sentence in that paragraph 4, page 2, but here is what it would tell you. Like, remember, it says, philosophy wouldn't tell you whether you're in New York or Zanzibar, but here is what it would tell you. And suppose my first question was, are things what they are or not? Now, how will that strike somebody? Are things what they are or not? The immediate answer would be, if that's what it would tell you, who needs to know that? Obviously, things are what they are, so that's a useless subject then. You would have, in effect, shot down your own motivation. You build it up, and then in the presentation of it, it went back to being a useless abstraction, even though it's supposed to be an example to concretize. Now, what is it that makes a beginning audience, by the time you get to are they what they are, able to take it? Because that in itself is prepared for by the earlier examples. You start with something that the audience grasps. Is this a world or universe ruled by laws, which is stable and so on, or is it chaos, miracles, unknowable, you're impotent? Now, in those terms, even freshmen know, yeah, there's something there, and they've seen, you know, all the things on TV about people bending keys and miracles and so on. So there's some kind of question here. They're into it. That is an actual question. Then, on that basis, you can go on to say, are things real or only an illusion? And you say, oh yeah, well, if everything was, of course, they don't have time to think this, but it amounts to, if it was a chaos, unknowable, and my mind was impotent, maybe it was some kind of illusion. It's prepared. Then, to take one other case where you could change the order and ruin it. Suppose we started with, are they the object or the subject of man's consciousness? Well, the question would be, what does that mean? It would be just as deadly if you said, are they the object or the subject of man's consciousness as your first question? By the way, I mean by object that which exists independent and so on, because then you're giving the audience a technical definition at a point where they don't see any reason why they need it. So they're suddenly stop the whole thing and give them a boring theory. As opposed to the way she does it, after that base in those questions, do the things exist independent of the observer, or are they created? Well, yes, you can understand that. Are they the object or the subject? By the time you get there, it is self-intelligible because it's been defined by the preceding sentence. Now, there's a brief idea on one paragraph of how you prepare the road as you go. And that, if we had the time, I could go through the whole thing that way, showing you the calculation in the structure. What points come in what order, what examples in what order, and so on. But I want instead to go to our last point, which is delimitation. Now, this article had to be rigidly delimited. It had to be down to 2 questions with one question rigorously omitted. What are the 2 questions that the author is definitely going to answer? What is philosophy is one, and the other? And who needs it? What is the question that she is definitely not going to answer? And she makes, in fact, later in the talk in part 2, she actually states, I'm not going to discuss this because it would be disaster if you tried. Yes?
What is the proper philosophy?
Right. What is the proper philosophy? That's out. Now imagine you're giving your talk to an audience, and you got a chance to say what you think, and you have to simply resist. Now, of course, Miss Rand suggests by her wording, but she does not say selfishness is right, logic is right, Kant is evil, because as soon as she did, that opens up a whole raft of questions that it's impossible for her to cover in this talk. The whole talk is consumed by what is it, this subject, and so on. As to what's true, that's another talk, and she has to adhere to that throughout. Notice also, she is as brief as she can be, so that, for instance, when she gets to politics, she's much briefer than on metaphysics and epistemology. Now, you could give a whole song and dance on what is politics or aesthetics, but that's not too central for her theme, because it's philosophy who needs it. And so for politics, she just needs the briefest mention of this as a branch of it, but the real thing she wants to sell them on is metaphysics and epistemology, so they get much fuller treatment. Aesthetics is actually thrown away in a sentence, just in effect to cover it, but that's not going to be the focus. So she doesn't say, by the way, aesthetics deals with the psycho-epistemological concretization and so on, and then that would be hopeless, and it would simply lose the audience completely. She just decides, that's out, I'm not going to try and do it. This is equally true in all of the specific formulations, that is the issue of delimitation. She's very careful not to raise issues that she cannot explain. Every point is carefully formulated, given the purpose. If you change some of the wording, as I now want to do, I want to show you how you will fall into a morass needlessly, simply by opening up a question that you have no means of dealing with. Now, this is the topic that I want to go into at greater length this evening, so let's take an example or two first. I want to discuss the issue of delimiting your formulation, the actual wording, not just simply delimiting what overall points you're including. And my purpose is to show you how to avoid raising questions that you cannot answer. To do so, I'm going to try to reword a couple of things to show you what would be non-delimitation, what would open up a whole kettle of chaos. For instance, suppose we take page 1. And suppose Ms. Rand had on her mind the idea, as part of the way to sell philosophy, I want to show them that philosophy is necessary for human happiness. So I'll stick that in early. So let us suppose that the third paragraph from the bottom on page 1, see that, paragraph 3 from the bottom, where she says, this is fantasy, you say, perhaps, and so on, but this is the way most men live their lives here on earth. And then suppose she just added one sentence. That is why they're so unhappy. That's all, period. And we then went on as before. Well, it's true, but what is the immediate thing that would go on in a listener's mind? And remember, the listener for whom this talk is designed. If he heard at that point a statement like that, what is the first question? Is it true that people are so unhappy? People have all kinds of different views on that question. And therefore, without anything to prepare you for it, it's not at all plausible that people are so unhappy. Or if they are so unhappy, what is the commonest explanation of the uninitiated as to why people are so unhappy? Today, in today's world, I mean. Well, the commonest answer I hear is because everything's falling apart and prices are so high and we don't have the good movies we used to, or whichever. Now, in other words, the state of the world as the cause. Now, that is understandable. If the audience already knew that philosophy was a necessity of human happiness, they wouldn't need this talk. Therefore, without any context, if you uttered that sentence at that point, you would raise the need to go into a whole dissertation to your audience. What is happiness? What does it depend on? What are its causes? How is it related to philosophy? And you couldn't possibly do that at this point to this audience because they don't know what philosophy is yet. Therefore, you would have shot down your talk. That would not be a self-contained formulation. It would not be understandable on its own terms. Now notice, Ms. Rand was able to get in a glancing reference to happiness a couple paragraphs later. And you see how she did it. You see the difference between a prepared, now not yet proved, but a prepared and a completely unprepared statement. Notice on the top of page 2, she says, the very top paragraph, men are asked these questions, they're not too sure and so on. The answer is what everybody does. The only trouble seems to be that they're not very active, not very confident, not very happy. Now, she does not there come out with philosophy as a precondition of human happiness, because put in that form, you have to then discuss it. What does she do, though? How does she prepare to make this plausible, understandable on its own terms? We've already had the 3 questions and the example of the astronaut's disorientation and fear, so we know it has some kind of relation to human emotions. And we've now translated the questions to people as they actually are. And it's true, we've given the example, I'm not too sure of what I'm doing, but I do what everybody else does. And then she says, but that makes them not very active, and the person can see in logic, if you don't know the answer, you wouldn't be that active. And introspectively, many of them can tell you, I don't myself do what I could because I don't really know what I'm doing. And then, of course, right after that is not very confident. Well, if you don't do that much, then it becomes, I don't know what I'm doing really, and you're suddenly aware, or a little bit more aware, I'm shaky, I'm confused, there's something here that is upsetting my balance and functioning, and then not very happy slides right off. It becomes more or less obvious in that context. Notice she doesn't say, this is the proof that philosophy is a precondition of happiness. She suggests within a framework that's prepared. It's relevant to your activity, your confidence, your happiness. She doesn't go beyond what she can establish. She says they're not very happy. Now, of course, she would say, in fact, without philosophy, you'll be miserable. But she doesn't say that here because it would be unprepared. She says you won't be very happy. That is an objective formulation in this context. And by the end of the talk, on that basis, she can then tell them you'll be miserable without it. You see, but you have to do it if you know what we call the spiral theory. You get it a bit, then you come back to a new point and you hit it again, round and round. Now let me give you one more example of a formulation needing preparation. You have to delimit, not rate. This is one of the hardest things for people to grasp, and yet it's one of the most crucial. Don't raise issues that you cannot deal with, that you cannot explain. I'll give you one last example. On page 2, this we should be able to do more briefly. On that paragraph 4, which is illustrating the questions of metaphysics. Suppose it all read as it was until we got to the sentence, are you in a universe which is ruled by law and so on, or are you in an incomprehensible chaos? And now suppose at that point, are you in an incomprehensible chaos, she were to say, or are you in an incomprehensible chaos like the universe of the Christian religion? Now that's true, and it's relevant, it's concrete, it would certainly motivate the hell out of them. But it would be impossible in this case. Why? So I'll give you another form of it. Suppose she were to say in the next sentence, are the things you see around you real, or is there a God? Now that's in fact completely defensible only. What would be the problem if at this point you gave those kind of examples? It would certainly bring metaphysics to life, but you would lose metaphysics altogether because the immediate question in your audience's mind would be, this is an assault on religion. How can she possibly defend that? Would raise all kinds of legitimate questions in their mind. How could she say religion is against law? What about God's law? Now, God is supposed to be the author of natural law according to certain religions, as you know. If you don't cover that, And of course, you leave that question wide open. You leave your audiences baffled. What about a great scientist like Newton, who thinks that space and time are the sense organs of God? Well, if she's going to put it that way, then the immediate question becomes, how can you account for a phenomenon like this if religion is the opposite of natural law? What about deism and the founding fathers? How can you say it's either reality or God? God is the author of reality, so there can be both, you see. It would be enormously confusing. Now, you say, you have no way in this talk to go into an attack on religion. It's not possible. There's no space for it. It would be a whole talk in itself. Therefore, what you have to do is say to yourself, I'm going to illustrate metaphysics. I'm even going to use religion, but in such a way that I do not raise topics I can't cover. So I'll say, for instance, are there laws or are there miracles? Does knowledge come by reason or by supernatural revelation? Now, those elements connote and suggest religion, but her attitude as a speaker is, if the shoe fits, wear it. If your idea of religion is that it's miracles and revelation, okay, fine. Now, you'll see what that does to human life. If it isn't, that's a separate problem. We're not here arguing religion. Now, this is a very crucial point that I would like to elaborate briefly. The importance of keeping your material self-contained. So let's leave the West Point talk for a few minutes now. I've said essentially what I want to say about it, and just give you the theoretical point that I've just illustrated. One crucial aspect of delimitation is keeping your material self-contained. When we say the broad point that your article or point has to be delimited, we simply mean, in the very concept of the piece, you have to decide what you're including and what you're omitting. You can only include so much. Now, the self-contained issue is a specification of this. It's a way of applying the broader issue of delimiting your point. The self-contained issue is this: include only that which you have room to explain or clarify, given the time and audience. And this applies to the basic points you include and to any given statement or example within it. If I stated it as a kind of a formal rule, it would be, do not include issues, statements, or examples that directly raise legitimate questions you are unable to deal with. Should I repeat that? Do not include issues, statements, or examples that directly raise legitimate questions which you are unable to deal with. Now, notice I say directly raise, because indirectly, every article raises every question. Because, for the point we made last time, all knowledge is interconnected. Therefore, indirectly, you can raise everything, and you can't avoid it. But I mean directly. In the kind of way, if you said, is it chaos or is there a God, you are directly raising the issue of God. Remember that I also stress legitimate questions. As far as illegitimate questions are concerned, you can't worry about them. Here I remind you of the point from last time: there is no such thing as the unanswerable, impregnable piece. You have to assume a rational audience, but one which does not know your particular material. If it already knows it, there's no need for you. And within that framework, you have to decide what would they need to have explained to them. And if a certain issue would not be clear and would require more elaboration for them to grasp it than you have time for, you ruthlessly excise it. Now, of course, it takes a lot of experience and sheer practice to know when does something need explanation and when doesn't it to a certain audience. One of the best ways is just talk to people and take note of when they become baffled. And if you see that the certain points characteristically baffle them, at a certain point you'll make the connection. This point has to be explained. The best thing that ever happened to me in this connection was when I was teaching many years ago at Hunter College. And I gave what I thought was a perfectly clear presentation, and I read the first set of exams. And I went into shock from which I did not recover for a long time. And I realized that things that you think are clear are not clear. And you have to, that was most borne in on me when one student, it was a paper on free will and determinism, one of the questions, and one student said that free will was guaranteed by the American Constitution. From that time on, I have always said when I introduce free will or determinism, this is not politics. If free will is true, it's true in Russia. If determinism is true, it's true in the United States. And that's turned out to be a helpful clarification, which I learned only from experience. It never would have occurred to me in advance. So you build up from experience a certain knowledge. But you can also use yourself as a standard in this situation. If you're not sure what to include, it is sometimes helpful to ask yourself, what did you need to learn? At the point when you first discovered this material, and remember, everything that you're going to present to the audience, you had to learn at some point. If you can reconstruct when that was, and remember, what was unclear to me in those days? What would I like to have been told when I first heard this point? What would have made it easier for me to grasp? You will find, if you can recreate that, that is a helpful thing to use in deciding when is a point self-contained and when does it need further elaboration. But one caution here. You cannot use only your personal autobiography, particularly if you're a college student, because all of us who have gone through college, and particularly graduate school, have had our brains warped, I include myself in this, in many ways by outlandish teaching and all kinds of vicious ideas that are thrown at you so fast you don't even know how to begin untangling them. By warped, I don't mean permanently, but I mean to the point where you're thoroughly confused and it takes a long time to delouse yourself, intellectually speaking. Now, you may, as a result of schooling, have got yourself so confused that what you would need to become clear is much more than a normal audience would ever dream of needing. Therefore, take into account your audience. When you apply this biographical standard, be sure you are not reflecting the added confusion which is your heritage from going to a modern American college. But if you set that aside, asking yourself what you would need to know, you as a rational being, is a helpful test. Whatever is a legitimate question by that standard, you have to be prepared to answer or else omit the point or recast it so it doesn't come up. Now, a few qualifications. There are some things that are you have to comment on in your piece, let us say, but you can't cover them fully. You can make what is known as a glancing reference. In other words, you can indicate in passing, I know I'm raising such and such, I can cover it here. As long as you do that, that's okay. You're giving a talk, let us say, on emotions to a group of psychologists, and you haven't got the space or time to go into free will, but you know they're all advocates of determinism. You can say at some point, I'm addressing you on the premise that man has free will. If you want to argue about that, do it later, but I can't argue about it or discuss it today. Now you put your cards on the table. In other words, you keep track of your audience's knowledge. They have to know, is this a point he's going to cover, or is this something he's assuming, but he's not going to cover it and we're not expected to do it, to follow this or to agree with this particular point from his presentation. Some things, I should point out, don't need any explanation to a given audience. For instance, if you're giving a talk to a general audience today, there are many things which are not philosophic primaries that you can blithely say without elaboration because they're regarded as common sense and obvious. For instance, the world doesn't owe you a living. Now, that's not a philosophic primary. That's not self-evident. In fact, that comes out of ethics, and you'd have to give, if you wanted to give a proof of that, you could go on for hours just to give the bare bones. But it is not necessary. It's not necessary even to give an indication to an audience today, because that much you can take for granted as common sense. If someone then in a question period or after wants to discuss it, you can do it. Or if you're discussing to an American audience, you can say man has certain inalienable rights. I agree with the founding fathers. If you're discussing an outrage such as Iran, you can say this is an outrage. And you don't have to go into an elaboration, because that has reached such an extreme that even the far left is falling all over itself to say that it's bad. Now, to a certain extent, this issue is contextual. When I first started to argue against the draft, you had to give a whole song and dance before people would even dream that such a viewpoint was possible. And I've noticed today that many audiences will nod right away and they think the draft is wrong, probably for the wrong reasons, but nevertheless, less of a discussion is necessary. So you do have to take into account what the audience already understands. But leaving aside this type of point, when your material raises legitimate questions, you must cover them. This is essential to making your material clear and self-contained. Otherwise, you may say the truth and nothing but the truth, and yet your whole presentation will collapse, it will confuse the audience, and it will baffle or alienate them because of the form of your presentation. And this, of course, the broader topic here is the context of the audience. I hope you don't understand me to say avoid controversy or be non-committal. That is not the meaning of my message. You can take passionate stands, make absolute commitments, say the most outrageous, shocking things in the world. That is not the point. The point is, say what you can explain or clarify. Say what you can present within an understandable framework. All right, let me give you homework on this topic of the self-contained. I want you to read 2 articles for next time. One is in Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. It's the article, it's part of the article, The Wreckage of the Consensus, and in the edition I have, but the pages vary according to the edition. It starts on page 226. It's the part of that article that deals with the draft, Miss Rand's attack on the draft. The first sentence of the part I want you to study is, the institution that enables our leaders to indulge in such recklessly irresponsible ventures is the military draft. Read from there to the end of the article. And here I'm concerned with one main topic. In what way is this worded, presented in such a way as to be self-contained? In what way does it deliberately not raise certain types of issues that, if raised, would collapse the whole thing because they go into topics that you simply haven't got the space for? Now, to help you see that, I would like you to read a second paper on the draft, which is the second article in the exercises which you have had distributed to you. It's called simply the draft. You'll see that it covers the same essential points as Miss Rand's does. It is not by her, needless to say. It takes the right viewpoint, it's against the draft, and so on. But there is a major, major difference. There are many differences, but one in particular, on the issue of being self-contained versus not. So read those 2 and see if you can mark as many places as you can where one paper raises topics that are not self-contained and the other makes its points very clearly but does not get involved with issues that it can't explain. Find as many examples as you can of the differences on that one topic, and we will go over that next time. While I'm giving homework, let me also suggest that you read the first, let's say the first 4 of the next section of the homework exercises, the section entitled Excerpts. And those are listed what? A, B, C, D? Then read A, B, C, D. Just simply to familiarize yourself with the material, and we will, I think, get to those next time. Now, before we turn to the next topic this evening, I want to acknowledge a comment that was made at the intermission, which I thought I had covered, but I'd take this opportunity to stress it again. Someone observed that I made writing sound very complex and frightening, as though the fact that you can analyze certain virtues in a piece after it's written means that every one of those points has to go through the writer's mind consciously as he's writing. Of course, that is not true at all. You cannot possibly write or expect of yourself that you say to yourself, now I'm going to write on whatever, the structure of the molecule of something or other, and at the same time say, now all I want to do is remember my point plus motivating, concretizing, delimiting, organization. Your mind would just give up altogether. What you do when you actually sit down to write is forget every piece of advice and information you've ever heard. However it comes out, that's how it comes out. There's nothing else you can do or should do. The purpose of discussion in advance is to help certain things become clearer to you. Then when you go to actually sit down to write, you forget it all. You remember the Crow epistemology. If you don't motivate, too bad. I mean, you tried, you listened, but you can't do everything. Then you'll find the articles, the audience isn't that interested. The next time you'll remember, and hopefully the discussion will have helped you. Do not sit down with the idea of all these imperatives pressing on your skull, because you'll be completely paralyzed. Take in what you can, put it aside completely, write freely, just as it comes to you. And then when you edit it after, you can look at it and say, is this logical? Is it clear? Do I need an example, etc.? If you do it that way, and if you don't attempt something beyond your knowledge, I don't think you should be alarmed by this course. But if you think I'm saying all those considerations that were present in Miss Rand's article, you should have the equivalent fraught on your pen each time you go to move it, you just have to roll over and give up, because it cannot be done. It takes many, many years, and there's always new things to learn. So the best advice I could give you is just relax completely and expect nothing after you've done what you can to digest the points that you can grasp, and then improve in editing if you can. Now, let us go to another topic, not one of the technical methods of communication, but a different kind of topic. And first I want to know how many of you did read this short paper on certainty, which I'll find. You see, the virtues of a non-college class that everybody... Now, how many of you, if you had to choose between, I'll give you a choice of 3 evaluations. A very good paper, this particular one. A very bad one, or mixed, some virtues and some flaws. Let me see by a show of hands how many would say this is very good. Oh, maybe a couple of dozen would say that. How many would say this is very bad? Slightly more. How many would say this is mixed, some virtues and some flaws? Well, that is obviously by far the dominant sentiment, which is very interesting, because that's not my opinion. But I don't want to go into that quite yet. Before I give you the theory, I just wanted to see what the actual facts were. How would you rate this paper from the aspect of motivating an audience? How many would say very good? Oh, that's good. Actually, this paper was written for a graduate school, and you do not have to motivate a professor. So you can free the author on that count. How many would say this paper was good with regard to concretization? Nobody's hand went up. So that's true. This is extremely abstract, so it's not too good on that. It does have a certain organizational structure. You can follow it. And within its own approach, it is delimited. But there is something else that I want to look at this paper, not any of the points. This paper was written to be read. It was a class paper in graduate school in philosophy. It was an assigned topic. Now, before I get to it, I want to present you the theory. So forget this paper for a moment. We're concerned now with what you can call the quality of argument, your approach to argument as such. I want to discuss the topic of rationalism. 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 The most widespread error of today's intellectuals, the most harmful error, I would say, virtually inescapable by college students, certainly by graduate students in the humanities, a very harmful and destructive error. It also has the effect of enormously alienating non-intellectuals or non-professionals in the field. And for both of these reasons, it's therefore very crucial that we discuss this error near the beginning of a course on communication. This is the arch disease of today's intellectuals. If you haven't got it yourself, I congratulate you. But if you haven't, you still need to understand it. Otherwise, you will find today's intellectual world unintelligible. Your professors and their publications, and you will simply end up, in effect, deciding people are hopeless and withdrawing. If you do understand this error, you can inoculate yourself against it and explain the countless forms that you see around you. Now, you probably know that the term rationalism is used in philosophy to designate a broad school contrasted with empiricism. These are two technical terms standing for two schools of philosophy that have been at war with each other from Greece to the present time. Rationalists, roughly, are those philosophers who stress the role of reason or logic in the acquisition of knowledge, and they disparage or deny the senses. That includes people like Plato, for instance, or Augustine, Descartes. Empiricists, on the other hand, that would be people like John Locke, David Hume, the modern pragmatists, stress the role of experience or sensory evidence, while denying or minimizing logic. Now, as pure philosophy, both these schools lead to disaster, and objectivism rejects both sides, both camps. If you knew objectivist epistemology, and here I have to count on your knowing it, you would see that we would entirely repudiate the idea of reason versus observation, because we say knowledge is acquired by the use of reason applied to observation. So it's the integration of logic and experience, not an either-or situation. But what I want to do in this course is focus on rationalism in a somewhat different sense than the technical definition that I've just given. Rationalism as a profoundly mistaken method of thought. And in this sense, it's used not only by technical rationalists, but by most of the people who call themselves empiricists and by many others who never heard of either school. The essence of rationalism, as I'm using the term, is deduction without reference to reality. Now, I'm just simply here plunging in with the definition. Deduction without reference to reality. In other words, this method consists of ignoring reality, ignoring observational evidence, seizing in a vacuum on some idea, some premise, some theory, which sounds plausible to the writer, and then proceeding to deduce from it a set of consequences. The result is like a floating construct. In fact, it's completely arbitrary, even though it may appear imposing. There may be a whole chain of if this, then this, if this, then this, therefore, QED, and so on, with all the apparatus of deduction, but it all rests on nothing, like a castle in the air. Very often it culminates in a conclusion which is blatantly in opposite of observed facts, but the person says, what can I do? I've proved my conclusion, so much the worse for the facts. In other words, you start with an arbitrary preconception, unthinkingly taken as self-evident. That would be the practical equivalent of Plato's innate ideas. Then there's a chain of deductions which follow usually quite rigorously, leading to a conclusion that completely defies reality. It's thinking without looking at reality, thinking as a kind of game of manipulating words without reference to what's out there, to existence. Thinking where what you're concerned with is the relation of one idea to another idea, not the relation of your ideas to reality. Now, if I can repeat an example I've given in another course, Miss Rand once invented this eloquent example. A rationalist type would come out with some premise such as man has only two eyes, so therefore he should be able to see only two things, one with each eye. Now the rationalist doesn't ask why. It sounds neat, symmetrical. Two things, two eyes, it all fits. At which point two schools of philosophy would arise. One says, well, we have to accept the conclusion. Men do see only two things. Everything else they don't actually see. It's an illusion they just think they see. To which the opposing school says, oh yes, men do see countless things, not just two, but that's because of all the hidden eyes that we have. Now you see, if you say to this type, but look, it isn't true. If you look at reality, you'll see the fact is men do have only two eyes, and they do see many things. That is irrelevant to a rationalist type. Reality does not have any status in his thinking. He has decided that his conclusion about eyes is good, and his idea supersedes all facts. So what it amounts to is the obliviousness to reality on the part of a thinker. It's ideas above reality. If you remember last time I said the first crucial point of communication is that it's conceptual, and that a concept is shorthand for concretes, and that you must always bear this in mind. Well, a rationalist represents a total failure on this particular point. In his case, concepts cut loose from reality altogether, and he creates his own world of concepts. It has a definite structure. Rationalists are very big on logic. There's a beginning, a middle, and end. You know where he is and where he's going, and there's always therefore, QED, like geometry, which they love as a subject matter. But it all floats cut off from reality. The conceptual shorthand, which is supposed to be our way of holding a mass of concretes in a reduced number of units, that shorthand becomes a world of its own, just like Plato's world of forms. And the result is, if you ask the rationalist about his imposing structure, you point to his starting point and you say, but why? Why that? He generally looks at you baffled and says, well, but what do you mean why? That's where I start. This whole structure, in other words, collapses very easily. Now, you can be a rationalist positively, that is, in allegedly proving something of your own. Or you can be a rationalist negative, that is, using this method to refute an opponent. That leads to what we can call rationalist polemics. Now, in this case, you're trying to refute an opponent, not by pointing out facts of reality, which he overlooks. You forget about facts. You show him instead that his ideas contain an internal contradiction. You show him that his ideas contain an internal contradiction. In other words, in this type of polemics, you accept the basic premise of your opponent. You say to him, okay, I'll concede your fundamental point, but I'm going to show you that somewhere along the line you contradict your own beginning. Now, this is a very inadvisable method of argument. There's obviously nothing wrong with showing a man that he has contradicted himself. That can be a valuable thing to do. But if you engage in this type of approach as a characteristic method of argument, what you do after a while is tend to become oblivious to reality. You train your mental eye to focus exclusively on your opponent, to see how you can trap him while accepting his premises. You train yourself to focus not on the relation of what he says to reality, but on a world of ideas apart from reality. This is very harmful to your intellectual development and your ability to argue or present ideas. It's training in widening a breach between your mind and reality. And it characteristically fails, I may add, even as polemics, because once you accept your opponent's basic premises, he sets the terms thereafter and you're at his mercy. This method of rationalism, I may point out, is characteristically used by theologians, if you want another example. They've decided in advance of thinking by means of revelation, they say, what conclusion their reasoning is supposed to lead them to. And then they simply ignore facts. They're oblivious to reality. But they want to prove their conclusion because they claim to accept reason, many of them. And therefore, as it's put, they cook up an argument which will lead them to the conclusion that they know in advance from revelation they want to establish. They juggle ideas around until they get them into the pattern where the ideas allegedly justify the conclusion that was sent by revelation. This is reasoning as rationalization. It's not following reality or following the facts where they lead, but it's going through a pretense, making up arbitrary premises and connections in order to come out at a prearranged spot. Now, this is something, unfortunately, more widely done than merely by theologians. It's invalid. It's something I urge you not to do. Now, if people said openly when they were engaged in rationalism what they were doing, there would be no problem in detecting it. Usually, however, rationalists do not exist in pure form, in really pure form. What you get in real life cases is the individual ignores reality, but he doesn't ignore it so consistently that you are dazzled by his ignoring it. He smuggles in elements, facts, observations as necessary, because it's very hard even today, in today's schools, to be completely out of touch with reality. The result is that you get the typical paper half floating free, half anchored to or tied to some facts. But typically, since the facts are smuggled in, they're not introduced in the proper order or with the right context, and consequently they're unconvincing, and they fall to pieces the moment you breathe on the paper. And therefore you have an allegedly convincing, deductive, impregnable structure that just floats into nothing as soon as you ask a few whys. Now, I want to illustrate this by reference, I'm sorry to say, to this paper on certainty, which, as I say, was submitted by a graduate student a number of years ago and did receive an A. Now, this paper on certainty is a very good example of rationalist polemics. Some of it, if you're a beginner in philosophy, may seem to you technical, but don't worry if any particular point or paragraph eludes you. It's not that important that you grasp every point of it. Simply try to get the idea, and you will see in the exercises that we do later the same type of thing on even simpler content. But I wanted a real-life paper to show you this, because if I make it up artificially, it wouldn't be as convincing. Let us begin by observing that this paper on certainty is detached from reality in two crucial respects. It's a graduate seminar course in philosophy, and the professor asked the question, can you be certain? Is knowledge with certainty possible? The student is arguing yes. And observe the method. He says, I will, a second paragraph, page 1. I'll attempt to demonstrate my viewpoint and so on and so on by pointing out that any other position involves one in a contradiction. So it's perfectly well stated from the beginning, this is going to be internal polemics. I'm going to take the opposite viewpoint and deduce from it contradictions. In what ways, therefore, is it by its very nature detached from reality? Point 1. There is no consideration of any argument in favor of skepticism. Skepticism, by the way, is the term for people who don't believe in certainty. There's no discussion in this paper of any reason why anybody would be a skeptic. What kind of considerations, arguments, facts, observations might lead to the conclusion that certainty is impossible. The author simply begins, my opponent has a viewpoint. Where it came from, I don't know. It's not up to me to ask. He has an idea. There is no certainty. That starts my universe. That's where I begin. He can come out and say there is no certainty. I lay that down as my starting point. Reality is simply irrelevant. The opponent, so to speak, created the Platonic world. He laid down proposition 1. And now we're simply focused on that. Where it came from, we never ask. Now observe the difference right off the bat. If you had started by reference to reality, if you had said to the skeptic, or in the paper, you had taken this approach, why would anybody think that you can't be certain? And you might say, well, for instance, people hallucinate, just to take one of the many arguments that skeptics actually offer. People hallucinate. They see things that aren't really there, and therefore, how do you know at any given time you're not hallucinating? So maybe you're always hallucinating, and therefore you never can be sure of anything. Now, that is not a good argument if you know the objectivist viewpoint, but that is an argument which attempts to start with some actual observation. There are such a thing as hallucination, after all, and then to build a structure on it. If you did that, then of course immediately you would have a line of answer that would tie you back to reality. Because what would you then think, assuming you knew some philosophy? Well, if you're talking about hallucination, we have distinguished hallucinations from times when we're not hallucinating. Otherwise, where will we ever get the concept? And how do you know when you're not hallucinating? Well, it's very simple. The difference between a pink elephant and a real elephant is that when you climb up on the back of a pink one, it hurts when you fall to the ground. In a real one, you can ride it. The pink one is only visual, but you can't integrate the other sense data and so on. And you can show the person they're making an unwarranted conclusion. The fact doesn't lead to it. You're in touch with reality because you made him give an argument. Start from somewhere. But in this paper, no. This is rationalism. We have no restrictions on him and no question where the theory came from. Merely, he said it, I'm going to deny it. Now, the second way in which this paper, by its very nature, is oblivious to reality. It offers no positive argument in favor of certainty. How many of you noticed that at no point, although the whole topic is certainty, does it ever give a definition or characterization of certainty? The central topic, which is certainly controversial, no reference anywhere to what it is. The person is not concerned. Why not? What is the implicit premise? Well, whatever it means, I'm going to refute it anyway. Whatever you say, I'm going to show that it leads to a contradiction, so what do I care what it means? I'm not out to show that we can be certain by pointing any kind of facts of reality. I'm out to show that your statement that we can't be is out. That's all. Therefore, it's up to you to worry about what it means. Now, notice the difference. If the student had begun, I'm not going to go into the whole thing because I would have to give you a whole paper extemporaneously, but what it'd amount to would be, we have minds, we're capable of perceiving reality, sometimes the evidence is conclusive, sometimes it's less than conclusive, in which case we make a distinction between the certain and the probable. Obviously, probable evidence presupposes the certain evidence, because certainty is one assessment, probability means less than certain, so first we have to grasp the certain, and each of the items of the probable has to itself be certain so that the sum of it can be said to be probable, and you go on, etc., etc. I'm not going to go into that. You would be able very easily to say, by the nature of knowledge, of consciousness, we start out in contact with reality, we're aware of reality, that is certain, and there'd be no problem. This paper doesn't do that. It doesn't try to establish certainty positively or even ask the other guy to refute it negatively. It just starts and is going to deduce contradictions from it. Now, this is unconvincing even in its own terms, because then suppose he does deduce contradictions from the original statement. What immediate question is left that is nowhere answered? Yes, why does this paper lead to contradictions? Why does this thesis lead to contradictions? The student who wrote it can't say. He doesn't know what in reality raises the topic, and therefore all he can say at best is, well, your formulation, I can jiggle around in such a way as to come out with the contradiction, but why and what it all means is not explained. How does he in fact go about establishing the contradictions? Well, I'll show you as we go along. At each crucial point, he makes a passing reference to what? Some certainty or other, some absolute, some framework which is serving as his foundation. But of course he doesn't say, I am here taking this for granted as certain, because he's not supposed to be taking anything for granted. He's supposed to be just refuting. Consequently, instead of stating forthrightly his viewpoint and his base, he smuggles it in. When he feels that he's sinking, he brings in something else as more ammunition. But it's not convincing, and of course, having conceded to the skeptic in advance the right to make the original statement that you can't be certain, he will never convince anybody by that method. Now, let me give you a few examples from this paper. I could subject it to a painstaking, but what I fear would also be to you a painful, detailed analysis. But just a few points so you can see why you cannot use this method. Suppose at the very beginning, he says, I'll point out, and this is paragraph 2, page 1. I'm going to point out that any other position involves one in a contradiction. Well, any skeptic worth his salt would immediately say, well, so what? Everybody's viewpoint on everything is contradictory. That's my whole reason for being a skeptic. No one can ever attain consistency, so what does that prove? Or the skeptic will say to you, just because it's a contradiction, how do you know that's wrong? We don't know anything. That's my whole viewpoint. Now, this student is trying to say, well, if you can't know anything, then so-and-so follows. But think of that idea. If you can't know anything, what follows from that? Zero. Close up shop. If you can't know anything, go back to the cradle. That's it. But you can't say, all right, let's assume we know nothing. This is now all the things that follow from total ignorance. Now, you see, you wouldn't get in that position if you said to yourself at the outset, now look, you are denying the existence of human consciousness, because certainty is such and such. It's inherent in consciousness as such, and therefore you are denying consciousness. But you see, we left out reality. We're not saying what is certainty, what is the fact. We're just letting him start, and therefore we're doomed from the outset. Now, for instance, to take us another example, the infinite regress argument. You know, that's elaborated in paragraph 2. And it's you can't be certain, and then the opponent says, well, are you certain of that? And he says, no, I'm not certain of that. And then the opponent says, are you certain of that? And he says, no, I'm uncertain that I'm uncertain that I'm uncertain, and so on. Now that is sort of like party polemics, but by itself, without anything further, that is not a valid argument. Why not? Well, look what would happen if you have a knowledgeable skeptic. A knowledgeable skeptic would immediately come back and say, well, I could do exactly the same thing with certain. I can force you into an infinite regress. Because you say, I'm certain of so-and-so. Are you certain of that? And you say, yes, I'm certain that I can be certain. Then he says, are you certain of that? You say, well, I'm certain that I can be certain that I can be certain. As many times as you can ask him, is he certain of uncertainty, he can ask you, are you certain of certainty? So you're back in an infinite regress too. Now you immediately, of course, feel in your mind, well, there is some funny difference here. But of course, this paper doesn't say what the difference is. Obviously, what is the difference? Why is it not fatal regress in the certainty case, but it is fatal in the skeptic case? What's the whole difference between the two? Both sides are claiming knowledge, and knowledge implies certainty. Now, the certainty guy is happy to say, yes, I imply a whole infinite certainties. But the other one can't be happy because he's denying certainty, therefore he's systematically contradicting himself. But what is it that we have to establish to make that distinction? Why does knowledge require certainty? Why does every claim commit you to certainty? Why? The fact of infinite regress doesn't establish that. Why does it? Because certainty is inherent in being conscious as such, and skepticism is the invalidation of consciousness. Since that's so, anybody who opens his mouth is forced back into a fatal infinite regress because he's trying to say something while saying he's incapable of it. But only because of the essential fact here, which the author is oblivious to. Now, the author is obviously not too happy with the first argument because he goes on, whereas if this was that convincing, you'd think he'd quit. Well, of course, you could say partly he was trying to fill up pages because it was for school. But even so, he goes on to the next step. Now look at the next paragraph. That last long one on page 1. What I wish to demonstrate now is that this version and so on is itself not an intellectual position, that nothing is being said, and therefore nothing is being considered that you could consider or refute. Now that is the neatest trick of the week. Why? Yes, first of all, he just refuted it. And second of all, he goes on at great length to refute it. Now, if nothing has been said, how could he be doing this? I mean, if nothing is being said, that would be the same as though the advocate of skepticism was saying, "Here's to triddle, to gloop, to tweedle." Nothing is being said. You can't refute it. But if I said, you said nothing, and here's what it leads to. Now, of course, what he means is, you're not saying anything with certainty. But the skeptic comes back and says, what? Of course I'm not saying anything with certainty. My whole point is, I can't, you can't, there is no such thing as certainty. Why should there be? Now, there is nothing in all of this, you see, that answers it. The person concedes the opponent's premise. He's allegedly going to show what follows from it, but by conceding it, nothing follows from it, and he's wiped himself out. Now, I could do that over and over, but let us turn, well, for instance, just before we leave page 1, observe right in the early, that paragraph, the last paragraph, the truth of this derives from the law of excluded middle, which states that anything either exists or does not exist. Now notice we're leaving open, can you be certain of anything? We don't know that yet. And what has the person brought in right at this point? A basic law of logic. Has he said, my foundation is certain axioms are absolutes and logic is one of them? No, because then the question is, can you be certain? And he's omitting that. Well, if you can't be certain, how do you suddenly bring in the law of excluded middle as if, well, no one could possibly contest that? If the person is going to contest all consciousness, he's certainly going to be prepared to contest the certainty of logic. Now, let us go on to page 2. So I'm passing over many other points, but I want you to see how you can destroy what seemed to many of you to be at least partly plausible. It just simply disintegrates. Take a look for another example at the big middle paragraph on page 2, the second. Now, he's trying to show here that that if a person tries to get out of the skepticism by saying, well, there's only one certainty, and that is that you can be certain of nothing. He's trying to imagine now that the original position has been amended to take account of his allegedly destructive criticism. So the skeptic is now having an amended view, which is you can't be certain of anything except one thing, and that is uncertainty. And now he's going to show, okay, let's accept that as the given. I won't bother with the fact that that's a contradiction, so I'll accept that. And now I'm going to show you all the other things, he says, that you also have to be certain of. Now let's see if any of this stands up. And I'll show you by showing you if there were a skeptic standing over the shoulder here, what he would say. Well, start that sentence right in the middle there. He must be certain that something exists about which he is uncertain. Well, of course, the author thinks that he's established what? Existence, reality. So he's so happy. Well, what would the skeptic say on the basis of what's been stated here? He'd say, yeah, something exists about which I'm uncertain, namely uncertainty. Now remember, you might say, but what are you uncertain of? How can you have uncertainty without recognition of reality? But that's the positive base that's left out. If you just go by the formulation, something must exist about which he is uncertain. The skeptic would say, yes, uncertainty exists. That's what I'm uncertain of. Or the next phrase, that he who is uncertain exists, to which the skeptic says, yeah, and all I am is a state of uncertainty. Or that he who is certain of uncertainty is capable of being certain of at least part of that which exists. Answer, yes. The part I'm uncertain of is certainty, etc. That you can communicate to others. The skeptic says, I don't know if there are others. Maybe there are, maybe there aren't. Now take a look, for instance, at the paragraph on the large, second last paragraph on page 2. As another example, also of this rationalist polemic. He's starting a new tack now. He's still not satisfied that he's really wiped out the skeptic. So he's going to try and show that all of the arguments for skepticism must have something in common. He doesn't give the arguments for skepticism because he's not here concerned with facts. He's concerned with deduction. So he's going to show what the skeptic argument would have to be if the skeptic were to offer it, which he didn't and doesn't. But nevertheless, and that's very typical of rationalist polemics. You figure, how could my opponent defend his case, even if that isn't what in fact he says? And then you refute this complex argument that you made up. And almost invariably, your opponent hears it all and says, but that is not the argument I would have offered. And the rationalist is very disappointed because he's analyzed the whole thing, only it's not the argument. Now the standard skeptic argument is illusions, hallucination, error. You know, there's a whole bunch of standard arguments that the skeptic uses, but he's got his own one made up here. This is the last big paragraph of page 2. The skeptic would have to show that certainty is contradictory. Why? Well, he says that's the only thing you could know couldn't exist, a contradiction. So if you know that there is no certainty, you have to know it's a contradiction. How does the author establish that's the only way you could do it? Does he say anything at all about that? Zero. Where does he actually get it from? He has in his mind, well, A is an absolute. That we know. And if something violates A as A, it couldn't possibly exist, neither of which points, of course, he's made in this article. He's prepared to stop with that. Is there any other way of something not existing? He can't think of it. If you're a rationalist, this sounds good enough. That's enough. That gives me a nice firm thing to go with, he thinks, and then he's going to show that skepticism can't do this. But the whole thing is out of the blue, completely arbitrary. All a skeptic has to say is, where do you get this idea that the only way to prove that something doesn't exist is by means of a contradiction? There's no argument offered in this paper for that. It's certainly much more controversial than the question of skepticism. The same thing is true if you turn to page 3. The author is now trying to show that the skeptic position is meaningless because contradictions are meaningless. Now observe, he has left open, can you be certain of anything? In other words, is man conscious? He's prepared to leave that debatable. But what does he know for certain that he can use in polemics? Anything contradictory is meaningless. He has a theory and a definition of meaning, but he doesn't know whether man is conscious. Well, how does he know that theory of meaning is true? If it's true that everything that doesn't refer to reality is meaningless, what about Santa Claus as a term? Doesn't refer to reality, is it meaningless? I mean, there's all kinds of questions here that the author is simply oblivious to. There's an obvious, what about the term God? Is that meaningless? Now, it doesn't refer to reality if you're an atheist, but is it meaningless? Well, if it's meaningless, there's an awful lot of discussion that's completely meaningless. Now, this author simply decided as follows. I got a good argument here. If something is contradictory, it doesn't refer to reality, and if it doesn't refer to reality, it's meaningless. Therefore, if it's contradictory, it's meaningless. But he would have to show that certainty is contradictory. But then certainty would be meaningless, and then his position is wiped out because his very position is meaningless. That's what I'm going to do. And he goes through that whole little thing, and there is absolutely no reference to such an obvious thing as how do you know what's meaningless, and what about these words that don't refer to reality and are meaningful? But you see, he's in his own rationalist world. He's got his deduction. It's perfect. It ends up wiping out the position, and he is simply oblivious. Now, I could, as I say, go on and give you other examples, but that should be ample to simply give you an illustration. Now, this was an A paper. It's well structured. It's clear, but it is a thoroughly rationalist paper. And even therefore, if you don't remember the particular examples, or if you find any particular point abstruse, if you could try to just hold it in mind, such parts as you can get, because it's not worth the time to go into the details. Don't blame yourself if you find it difficult, because it is a graduate school paper. But it's such a terrific example of this problem that I couldn't resist using it. Now, I may tell you that the author of this paper was me. This is one of the first papers I submitted in graduate school. And I did not do it as a literary exercise. I thought this was perfectly good at the time that I submitted it. I was quite convinced. I thought I really had refuted the skeptics. This was my first year in graduate school, 1954. And this was entirely how I was trained, how I had been trained. And it took many years to overcome this kind of rationalism. But I think I've shown you that across time you can do it. I deliberately wanted to choose this at the outset because some of you will be volunteering later, and I thought to reassure you I would be the first horrible example. So you could see that as low as you start, you still can get out of it. And that's a pretty low start here. In any event, for what it's worth to you, you can keep that in mind as an example of rationalism. So to sum up the two main points from this evening, one, keep your material self-contained, and two, do not as a crutch do it by means of floating deduction. Always keep your eyes on reality. In other words, avoid rationalism. Thank you very much. Now I have a number of written questions, so I'll take some of those first, but I'm going to, in this course, alternate back and forth, but I will give preference, if you go to the trouble of writing, to written questions. Some are on the content of philosophy, and some are on communication, and I'll try to take the communication ones first, or ones directly from the lecture. How can a person assess whether he's gotten his point across as he intended to? Well, that is a difficult thing that you have to learn, but to indicate briefly, one method you have is your audience response. I'm going to say something about that in Lecture 4 on monitoring the audience and determining whether they're following you, whether they understand, getting some kind of feedback. That would be possible only in oral presentations. The fundamental answer is, assuming a certain experience, you have to learn to acquire an objective perspective on your own work. What this means, I'm going to define objectivity in writing next time. You know, as this is, of course, an objective communication, I haven't defined objective yet, but I'm holding that off till next time. But in essence, I would say you have to learn the skill of writing something one day, being immersed in the content, then putting it aside, going out that night or going to sleep, come to it the next morning and look at it as an outsider, not as the one who wrote it, who knows all the ins and outs and everything that was in your mind, but as a complete stranger. And you say to yourself, in effect, well, what did he say in this thing? And you acquire an objective outside perspective. And that's what you have to do when you edit something. First, there's, so to speak, the white heat of creativity, where first there's the logical outline. Then you try to write it, following the outline, and you just let yourself go. And there you're not censoring, you're not evaluating, you're not doing anything except trying to get that content out. But then you let a little time pass, an hour or whatever, a night, and you come back and you look at it from the outside and you say, what does this say? What does it mean? Does it follow? Is it clear? Now that takes practice, but the only way you will be able to assess whether you've got your point across is, can you appraise it objectively, aside from you, the author, and what you know of your internal processes. Now that we'll have to discuss more next time. I have to stress again, you will not always get your points over. And audiences vary. Some are bored, some are tired, some are hostile, and therefore don't define your success by whether you get the point over, but by whether you do what's possible. That is, communicate on a certain theme within a certain context, assuming the audience is rational. Another one, you mentioned the intellectual bombardment of ideas that today's colleges inflict on students. How does one approach the task of sorting out and discarding these concepts and ideas which are abundantly thrust at students? That's a life work. You have to have the right philosophy to begin with, or at least that's enormously helpful. You have to know overall, what do you think on all the main types of questions and why? And that will alert you when poison is being thrust at you. Beyond that, you have to be on the premise that you are walking through a landmine situation. and that every sentence could be a grenade or an H-bomb about to explode if it's uttered by your professor in college in the humanities. You have to be on the premise of being critical of everything. Now, obviously, the Crow epistemology is true, so you can't be critical of everything. Some things, therefore, no matter what you do, are going to get by you. Your professor, let us say, will utter a sentence that has 8 main fallacies, and you'll only have the time to catch 6, and 2 will seem to you plausible through sheer exhaustion. I don't know any way around that. I went through 10 years of graduate school in which I tried not to let anything go by that I couldn't evaluate, and vast torrents went by me. And it took me years to get rid of the remnants of that. I don't know any way except know what you think as well as you can in advance, and then listen carefully and don't accept anything, particularly if it's, well, it sort of sounds okay, I'm not really sure, but he must know what he's talking about. It is not valid, that method. Now here's a question on philosophy, but it is really from last time, so I'll mention it. How does one differentiate the meaning of the concept eternal from infinite? You have stated that time is finite and yet the universe is eternal. And then there's a follow-up on that, but that's enough for right now. Very simple. Infinite means a quantity greater than any specific quantity. If there were an infinite number of stars, for instance, it would mean not a million, not a trillion, not a zillion, quintillion, godzillion, but still more. However many you said, still more. In other words, it would mean a quantity with no specific amount, no specific identity. And that is a violation of the law of identity. As Aristotle pointed out, infinity can exist only as a potentiality. In other words, you could say the number series is infinite, by which all you would mean is, however many you counted, you could continue to count. If you reach 1,000, you can have 1,001, a million and one. In that sense, there's no end. But actually speaking, however many you count, it's only that many. As Aristotle put it, infinity is a potential of addition or division, but in actuality, there's always only the finite. Eternal, on the other hand, is a different concept completely. Eternal means out of time, not in time. And obviously, the universe is eternal. You couldn't say how many years does the universe has it been in existence, because years is a standard relating the Earth to the Sun, and both of those are within the universe and are one tiny fragment of it. Time is a measurement of motion. To apply time to the universe as a whole, there would have to be some standard of motion outside the universe to which you were relating it. But clearly the universe is everything. There can be no standard out of it. So the universe is not in time, it is eternal. In exactly the same way as you could not say, where is the universe? Is it in Rochester? I mean, obviously, all places are in the universe, and so with all times. So time is a framework within a given aspect of the universe. And within any given aspect, it is finite. And then this questioner goes on, does Miss Rand have any published work on the concepts of space and time? No. Now, there seems to be a question. Oh, yes, there's a question on the Who Needs It article. On page 1, the third paragraph from the bottom, Miss Rand does say, quote, but this is the way most men live their lives here on Earth. Apropos of the audience has said, but no astronaut or person would ever act the way she's just presented the astronaut, and she says, but this is the way most men live their lives here on Earth. And then the questioner says, isn't the obvious question, is this true? In other words, is she there not raising a point that the audience is not prepared for? To that I would say there are two answers. She has not yet elaborated that point, but she does immediately in the next paragraph, because she goes right on to say they struggle to evade the questions, and that means they're like the astronaut, they don't want to answer. And to defend that, she goes on to say, you think you know the answers, 1, 2, 3, but you see those aren't really answers. And therefore, although that sentence as stated there is not yet defended, it is immediately defended in the follow-up. It is not something off the theme, which would require a whole discussion that's on a different subject, such as the causes of happiness. The other thing I would say is that sentence in this context can count on the audience's introspection. This is the way most men live their lives here on earth. Most of that audience is aware they don't have any clue what the answers to those questions are. They may not think it's bad, but they know they're not very clear on those things, and therefore it doesn't come as shocking to them the way it would if you said out of context, you're unhappy, which they were. I'm not unhappy, I just came back from a party. That's what I would say on that point. Please repeat the points you made about the difference between inductive and deductive reasoning when you were discussing the way Miss Rand began her article. Generally speaking, deduction is the form of reasoning which starts with an abstraction or a general principle and applies it to a particular case. Like all men are mortal, that's the general principle. Socrates is a man, that's a particular case. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. That's the classic example of deductive reasoning. It's the abstraction, then the concrete, as far as communication is concerned. Inductive reasoning is the reverse order in this situation. It would mean Socrates is mortal, Plato is mortal, Plotinus is mortal, and so is Tom, Dick, Harry, etc. You give a number of examples, then you say you get the point, all men are mortal. That's going from the concretes to the abstraction, and that is what's known as induction. Now, there is no rule which says that you must use one of these or the other in any presentation. Either is acceptable depending upon the material and the situation. In a very abstract discussion, however, you're always advised, or in most cases, to give some example first, because very broad abstractions are very hard to get. And you'd like, if possible, to avoid the situation where the audience wonders, what is he talking about? First give an example and then bring it in. As a general rule, I find that the most helpful. So I favor inductive approach, but I would certainly, there are a great many cases where deduction is necessary, and it would be completely artificial to avoid it. I may say, however, as against deduction, that's the infallible method of the rationalist. Rationalists will have no truck with induction at all because he doesn't bother with concretes, examples, sensory evidence. It's always, here's the proposition, what follows from it. So I would say be sure you use deduction properly, but if you do, that's okay. Now here is a confusion. Were you saying that the expression in the West Point article, quote, not very active, not very confident, not very happy, reflected Miss Rand's view concerning inappropriate metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, respectively? In other words, did I mean to suggest that she paired active with metaphysics, confident with epistemology, and happy with ethics? Frankly, I never thought of that, and if so, that point eluded me. That was not the intention that I was pointing out, and I don't think that would be her intention either. I think it was that the sum of confusion on the three branches would be, you don't know how to act, you don't feel sure of anything, and therefore you're not too happy. And what I was pointing out was simply, it's clearer to take that progression, because if you don't know what you're doing, obviously you won't be active. And that will pave the way for unhappiness, better than if you just baldly say you're unhappy, since happiness is a consequence. That was just a minor example, but don't put too much stress on that example. Now, before I go to more written ones, which I will get to, I'll take them from the floor if you have it. Yes, sir.
Yes, 4.1
points you made at the beginning, motivation and going from abstraction to concrete structure and delimitation, would that apply equally to fiction writing?
Would the 4 points that I made apply equally to fiction writing? I think I should really pass on that because I don't know anything about fiction writing. In a very, very generalized way, obviously some of them would apply. The reader has to have some reason to care about what you're doing, but by its nature, assuming you're not writing modern, non-objective fiction, I would say it would be easier because you're giving them a story and a real characterization and so on, rather than broad abstractions. Although I may be speaking from a professional bias, and maybe it's equally hard for a fiction writer. But in some form, the reader has to have some reason to do it. Of course, the methods would be entirely different. You would not begin a novel by saying, dear reader, I'm about to discuss so-and-so, my story will involve this, this is why you should be interested. Concretization, insofar as you have an abstract point, but not all fiction presents abstract points, hasn't necessarily an abstract philosophic message. Now, if it's a philosophic fiction, you have to balance abstractions and concretes. I would not necessarily say that all fiction, including non-philosophical, has to, in some form, it has to concretize what it's talking about. And it does it to a conceptual being, but you could not apply literally what I'm saying. It has to have a structure, but the structure is not the same kind of structure as in non-fiction. It obviously has to be limited. You can only cover so much in any novel, but the criteria of selection is the theme. So the application to fiction, I would not want to comment on. I really do not know. Never made a study of the writing of fiction, except when it's unintentional fiction. I have another, yes.
Can you suggest any professors you think are worthwhile in terms of philosophy?
Can I suggest any professors I think are worthwhile? Yes, any professor that's teaching objectivism. If you're asking me a philosophy professor, yes, there's several professors teaching objectivism, but I don't think I'll regale you with the whole list of them right at the time. You can come up afterwards. Professor Harry Binswanger, who runs the Objectivist Forum, is one, and Professor George Walsh, who teaches in Maryland, is one, and Professor David Kelly, who teaches in Vassar, is one, and there's a number of objectivist professors, but I'll have to ask those whom I don't mention to forgive me. I don't have a whole dossier at this time. Let me take another written one. Is it valid to criticize an argument or position as being oversimplified? This often amounts to criticizing someone for reducing an issue to its essentials, or of not having discussed every conceivable complexity or possible objection. Sometimes, however, the questioner goes on, a valid criticism is intended that relevant subtle distinctions or complexities have been ignored. Is oversimplification a valid concept, or does it entail an illegitimate package deal? If the latter, should a criticism that uses this concept be responded to in part by an explicit rejection of the concept, as one might respond to being called too black and white or too cut and dry? That is a very eloquently, accurately worded, economically worded question with which I entirely sympathize. All I can really say is yes, I agree. In other words, most of the time when you are told that you're being oversimplified, that is a compliment, contrary to the speaker's intention, because it does mean you are being criticized for reducing an issue to its essentials. And of course the method today is the exact opposite of the Crow epistemology and the exact opposite of the conceptual approach. Instead of wanting to teach people to think in essentials, the whole method of the modern approach is not to think in essentials and to obfuscate the content by drowning you in so many details, elaborations, examples, objections, counter-objections, and so on, that no one can hold it, and you simply bog down. That also completely disguises the content of a view if the view is really irrational. Now this, to my own first-hand knowledge, is one of the motivations involved, for instance, in doctoral dissertations. I've heard enough graduate students talk to know what, you know, the type that has one line of text and then a whole series of footnotes, and then another line of text and the rest of the page is footnotes. Now, theoretically, it's, well, I'm going to answer everything. There's going to be the impregnable article or impregnable speech. But actually, of course, every footnote raises another question, and there's footnotes to the footnotes, meta-footnotes, and so on. And that kind of thing, I've heard many people tell me quite openly, is deliberately done to break the professor's mind. In other words, it's like the sentence from Kant that I quoted last time. He is so overloaded with examples, complexities, and so on that he just tunes out and he figures this guy's quoting enough Latin and Greek, he knows what he's talking about, it's enough, I'll pass him. Now, from that context, I would say that whenever anybody tells me, or if I hear someone accused of being oversimplified, I bristle, because that is very broadly used as an attack on a virtue. However, as the questioner does go on to say, sometimes a valid criticism is intended. It is definitely possible to simplify improperly, to leave out so much that you've not only left out details and so on, but the whole essence, in which case you have not actually made your point. If it's a paper on certainty, for instance, and I say, obviously man can be certain because A is A, and I hand it in. That's too easy. I need a little more than that. Then the question goes on, is this a valid concept? Well, it's so much misused that I'm on the threshold of saying no. But what I would actually do in such a case is say, you have to tell me, what point have I omitted that would be relevant to the essentials of the presentation? I would not necessarily criticize this every time it came out of someone's mouth, but if it was a type which I thought was anti-essentials, then I would. So it's not quite like too cut and dried, but it's 90% of the way there. Any more oral questions? At the very back, a white arm, yes. I mean, white sweater, yes.
I'd like to ask a question about the point you made about not raising legitimate questions that can't be answered in the context of what you're saying. Sometimes you have the advantage of addressing a fairly friendly audience. If you're addressing a hostile audience, not even a passive audience, but a hostile audience, chances are that you're going to confront illegitimate questions, such as something that you accept as an axiomatic or ostensive concept. Your audience is not going to accept, and this is something that they're going to expect you to explain. What do you do in that kind of situation?
The question is, if you are addressing a hostile audience, not friendly and not neutral or passive, but actively hostile, how can you possibly apply the advice of not including material which raises legitimate questions because they don't accept even your axioms? Therefore, anything you would say to get off the ground, they will, according to the questioner, legitimately question. So what can you possibly do in such a case? My answer to that question is that that kind of audience either don't address at all or name that fact at the outset, if for some reason you have to. But normally speaking, if an audience is so hostile that there is no common ground, that is, they don't accept logic, they don't accept the common virtue, for instance, of honesty or working for a living, etc. They believe in irrationalism, mysticism, parasitism. There's nothing that you can say of a common sense or obvious kind as a framework by the nature of the situation. You simply cannot address them on those kind of topics then. They would have to be a really wicked audience. Now, the closest I can get to that type of situation is if you want to address a certain element within your audience when it's a mixed audience. For instance, you're addressing a faculty meeting. And you think there are some faculty members that are better than others, and that's the only way you can reach them. And you know that a good part of the faculty will have a fit no matter what you say. They're simply out of it altogether. The only thing you can do in such a case, without being needlessly obnoxious, or at least the thing I've done, is to say, I'd like to make certain comments on whatever the issue is. These comments are based on the assumption that freedom is desirable and that we should not emulate Soviet Russia. I understand that a good part of this audience does not agree. I will restrict my comments to those who do, and then go on from there. It does not endear you to the people, but you can't do anything with those people. All you can do is take cognizance of the fact that there are a lot of enemies, and you're not trying to reach them. On the other hand, it's not necessary to be so offensive if the audience, even if hostile, is polite. Now, there are forums, for instance, where an audience can be antagonistic and yet polite. That does exist. Hard as it is to imagine. Those of you who have been to the Ford Hall Forum will know that the officials there are very good in that respect, and you can address, as I've seen Ms. Rand do, hostile audiences. And she simply says, I hold such, and there's a rustle and a hiss. And the judge hits the gavel and says, we'll have none of that, we're asking for her opinion, her viewpoint. In that case, you go ahead, and sometimes you win certain people, intrigue them, sometimes you don't. The point is this: you cannot always satisfy every idea in your hearer's mind. That was not the moral of what I was saying. Generally speaking, I would say avoid hostile audiences unless you have some reason to address them, and if so, delimit very carefully what you have to say and name the main bone of contention at the outset so that you acknowledge it. Now, for instance, suppose I had to address the Flat Earth Society. You know, they don't believe the Earth is round. I mean, then there's such a gulf between us. I couldn't get off the ground on any subject if I didn't come in and say, I have to tell you first I believe the Earth is round. Because they view everything through that perspective, you see. But I wouldn't do that. So this is not a magical thing. I'd like to stress again what I said. All of it applies to addressing a rational audience. An audience that disagrees is not necessarily a hostile. If it's a hostile to you on the level that this questioner suggested, that raises grave questions of its honesty and rationality. And if so, you should rethink whether you're going to address it. And now a philosophical question. Could you elaborate on the point that certainty is inherent in consciousness? Yes, I'll do it briefly. How do we arrive at the concept of certainty? Obviously, you don't get it at the beginning. First, you get simply knowledge, a grasp of reality. Observation, you see something. You hold up your hand, you see it, it's there. Then you start to conceptualize after a year or so. You form concept, table, chair, and so on, so you build up a whole vocabulary. At this stage, everything is direct. The evidence is, in every case, perceptual, and the thing strikes you immediately as obvious. There would be no such ability to say, well, before you've conceptualized, maybe these are fingers, but I'm not sure. You would never have such an idea as maybe. You just look and you see, aha, that. If your mental state could be transcribed into words, it would be that. And then later you discover that is hand. And you're never going to be more certain than at that original moment. That certainty remains forever of your direct observations and your early concepts. All of it is certain because certain means conclusive. And there's nothing more conclusive than opening your eyes and looking. Now, after a long time goes by, many, many years, you reach the stage of saying, you know, there are some things that aren't like that. I don't know what it's going to be. For instance, Maybe my father will come home tonight at 8 o'clock and maybe not. I just can't tell the way I can when I hold my hand up. Now, he said he would, but then once he said he would, and he didn't. But then he usually does what he did, and so on. And after a while, I'm obviously making this up, after a while you get the idea. There is a case where you know something, but it's not as good as when you really got it straight. You contrast less than certain, uncertain, and then you can distinguish probable, possible, and so on within that. That is a far advanced stage of development, which would only be possible if you had first a lot of certain knowledge and the concept of certainty. More than that, in every one of those lesser states, for instance, probability, you have to have a massive certainty about the issue even to know that it's probable. For instance, your father isn't home yet. That's certain. Your father has come home in the past. That's certain. You have a father. That's certain. He said he would come home. That's certain, etc., etc. You're weighing a whole torrent of certainties. But together they add up to one uncertainty. Will he today at 10 o'clock? So if there were no certainty, you couldn't even get the probability off the ground. Now, in more detail, I cover that in Lecture 6 of the Objectivist Philosophy course. Could I please give some examples of theologians using rationalist polemics? All of them. The better ones. That is to say, the ones that try to prove their revelations. Aquinas, I'm sorry to say, is full of this. St. Anselm is perhaps the perfect example, the author of the Ontological Argument, because he is a Platonist, rationalist theologian, and a medieval on top of it. So, perfect if you want an example of rationalist polemics. Duns Scotus, William of Ockham, all those 12th, 13th, 14th century theologians. From the floor. You have to wave. I can only see motion. Yes?
The presentation is highly abstract. That is, it doesn't offer too many concrete. It's often difficult to understand. Is there any time that it would be legitimate to present it that way, or a certain audience?
Is there any time or audience when it would be legitimate to present a highly abstract presentation without examples? Yes. An audience that has the context necessary. For instance, if I were discussing certainty with graduate students in philosophy, and I assume that we had some framework established and so on, I would not do it with nearly as many examples as I would with freshmen, because presumably they already know all the examples, they've had it for 100 years, so we can go right on. Now, even there, sometimes examples are valuable, but the more your audience knows of the abstractions, the higher their knowledge, the less you have to concretize. Sometimes. I couldn't lay down absolute rules. What I could say is what our primary concern is communicating to a general audience. To a general audience, the more abstract, the more urgent that you concretize. Here's a written question. I have a few more still. If concepts are not equivalent to their definitions, one cannot learn a concept merely by learning its definition. What else is required? For example, does the definition merely point at the kind of existence a concept refers to, and one must then perform the process of differentiation and integration to fully grasp it? Please elaborate. Well, yes, I didn't make this point in the class, I don't believe, but a concept is certainly not equivalent to its definition. The concept, for instance, is philosophy. Its definition would be something like the subject which studies the nature of man, existence, and man's relation to existence. But that definition merely states the essence. It tells you the fundamental points and what distinguishes philosophy from other things. But by itself, that would certainly not permit anybody to grasp the concept. What would they need? Concretes, examples, enough so that they can see what are the kind of things included under philosophy and what are they differ from. Philosophy Who Needs It is a perfect example of that. Just as if I wanted to communicate the concept table, and you had never seen any, it would not be of any use to come in and say, table is a manufactured object with a flat surface and supports for the sake of supporting other objects. Because it's abstract now. True, it's not that abstract, but you'd have to say a flat surface with supports. You'd say, even there, if you're at the point where you need that explained, you have to say, you see this thing here and this thing here, as against this thing here and that thing there. Now, what's common is so and so. In other words, the best way to teach a concept, give examples of it, not too many, but at least a couple, so you can get an idea what's in common, as against what you're contrasting it with, and then state the summarizing definition. Now, I don't mean in every presentation you have to go through that song and dance, but whatever is appropriate, you should do. Someone here, I don't want to take the time to read this whole thing, quoted one of the sentences from the certainty article and says, I said the author accepted it, and it seemed to me that he didn't. Well, since I was the author, I can vouch. I meant the author accepted it provisionally. In other words, he was prepared to say, for purposes of refutation, let's assume that this statement was true. Now I'll show you what follows from it. Not that he actually believed it himself. But it's in that sense, rationalist polemics, the author accepts the thing that in fact he wants to refute. And now, a final two questions. Could this certainty paper be rewritten as you suggest and still be accepted in graduate school? Yeah, I think it could be. It would be hard because you'd have to keep in mind two contexts. Reality and your professor. You'd have to write, so to speak, with one eye on what makes sense and one eye on the particular distortions which are prevalent in that assignment. And what it would really amount to would be you'd give a decent case, but you'd keep interjecting. It might be assumed so-and-so, my answer is this. It would be like warding off hecklers. But in principle, if your question is, do you have to do it wrong in order to pass? No. And also, I may say, to be fair, in my experience, philosophy professors bend over backwards not to grade you down for disagreement. So if you give them anything to go on, they don't know that rationalism is even an option. I mean, they're not out to foist that on you. That's just what seems natural to them. So if you include reality, it strikes them as funny, but they won't necessarily fail you on those grounds. Now then it says, the other part of this question was, is it possible not to become rationalistic after years of higher education? How? I really don't know. I would think it's possible not to. But if you say years of higher education, the problem is the Crow epistemology, you see. Even if you're very aware of this, if you deal in the humanities or social sciences, you have to deal constantly with fantastic ideas, false ideas. You have to present them on exams and show what Professor A would say about Professor B if he heard Professor C, when all of them, A, B, and C, have no relation to reality, logic, or facts. And the sheer ability to hold that much mistaken ideas in your mind tends to sever your connections to reality because you can only hold so much. You can hold maybe A and B and C, and if you also bring in reality, you can't keep A in mind because it's too absurd. I found, to be quite frank, that when I was teaching the history of philosophy, I had a period where the clearer I was, particularly on German philosophy, in presenting it, the more rationalistic I was, because I would get involved in that world. Well, if Kant said this, then this, then this, and students would say, what would Kant say if you asked him so and so, and you'd have to think as he would think, and then it takes time afterwards to, so to speak, shift back to reality. in this sense, I would certainly not minimize it. Even your knowledge of this problem will not prevent you from succumbing to it in some significant part, so far as I know. All you can do is be self-conscious about it and try to, so to speak, to do double entry bookkeeping. That is, each time you say certain things, try to remember, oh yes, there's also reality, and how does this connect to reality? It'll take a special act of will until you make that part of your habitual method of functioning, and it'll be hard. It'll be easier just to memorize what's being said and make deductive connections and get the jargon, so to speak, and be oblivious to reality. But if you can fight your way through, in theory it should be possible, although I don't know anybody that has been able to emerge from many years of higher education in the humanities completely unscathed. There are degrees, and that's the hope. And one reason that I hammer this at the beginning is maybe this will help detailed discussion of it, some of you from succumbing, and you'll be spared some of the things that I and other people did have to go through. All right, we're over our time, so thank you very much. We'll continue next week.